The crack of gunfire shattered the desert calm, sending startled ravens into the sky as Colton Ingram holstered his smoking revolver without a backward glance at the man who'd drawn on him. The year was 1876, and in Terlingua, Texas, a man didn't waste words, especially not on the dead. "You killed him," whispered the bartender, peering over the swinging doors at the lifeless form sprawled in the dusty street. Colton merely tipped his hat forward, shadowing eyes that hadn't softened in years. He made his choice. He turned back to his whiskey, the amber liquid catching the dim light of oil lamps. No apologies, no remorse, just the silent understanding that in this corner of West Texas, a man lived or died by his decisions. The saloon gradually filled again, though patrons gave wide berth to the tall figure at the bar. At 32, Colton had accumulated a reputation that traveled faster than the stagecoach. 7 notches on his gun belt told the story of men who had underestimated the quiet cowboy with the 1,000-yard stare. He never said goodbye to any of them, never offered last words or closure. Death came quickly in the West, and Colton had learned early that sentiment was a luxury afforded only to those who hadn't seen what he had. It wasn't until the piano player resumed his lively tune that the saloon's doors swung open again, this time admitting a woman whose presence immediately commanded attention. She stood in the entryway, travel-worn but dignified, her simple gray dress marking her as neither saloon girl nor typical frontier wife. "I'm looking for Sheriff Dawson," she announced, her voice clear and unafraid. The bartender gestured toward the back. "Dead 3 weeks now, madam. Caught fever. Deputy's been running things such as they are." The woman's composure faltered only slightly. "Then I'll need lodgings until the next stage east. Is there a hotel?" "Widow Pearson takes boarders," offered an older man from a nearby table, 2 doors down from the general store. She nodded her thanks, gathering her small valise. As she turned to leave, her gaze briefly locked with Colton's. Something in her deep brown eyes made him shift uncomfortably, a directness that felt like a challenge, though she hadn't said a word to him. "Somebody ought to warn her," muttered the bartender as the doors swung shut behind her. "Town ain't safe for a woman alone these days." Colton drained his whiskey. "Not my concern." But even as he said it, something made him toss an extra coin on the counter and follow her out into the fading daylight. The woman walked with purpose, her back straight despite the obvious weight of her bag. He kept his distance, watching as she navigated around mud puddles from the previous night's rain. When a group of rowdy miners blocked her path, Colton's hand instinctively moved toward his gun, but the woman simply cleared her throat and the men, somewhat sheepishly, stepped aside. He was about to turn back when he noticed 3 figures emerging from an alley ahead of her. He recognized them immediately, the Blackwell brothers, trouble in human form who drifted into town the previous month. They positioned themselves directly in her path, the largest one grinning with malice. "Well now, what do we have here?" the man crooned. "You lost, pretty lady." The woman stopped, maintaining her composure. "Gentlemen, please let me pass." "Oh, we will, after you pay the toll." The man reached for her arm. Colton moved without thinking, closing the distance in long strides. "Back off, Blackwell." 3 heads turned his way, recognition and wariness spreading across their faces. "This ain't your business, Ingram," the leader growled, though his hand dropped away from the woman. "It is now." Colton's voice was soft, almost conversational, but the men recognized the threat beneath it. They exchanged glances, calculating odds they clearly didn't like. "Another time," the leader muttered, backing away. His brothers followed, shooting dark looks over their shoulders. The woman watched them go before turning to Colton. Up close, He could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. "Thank you, Mr. Ingram, is it? Though I should point out I was managing." "Those men don't take kindly to being managed, especially by a woman," he replied. She studied him for a moment. "Florence Wilson, I appreciate the assistance even if it wasn't strictly necessary." "Colton Ingram." He glanced at her valise. "You planning to stay long in Terlingua?" "Just until I can arrange passage east. My brother was Sheriff Dawson. I've come to settle his affairs." Understanding dawned on Colton. Sheriff Dawson had been one of the few decent men in the territory. "I'm sorry for your loss, madam." "Mrs. Wilson," she corrected. "Though I've been widowed 3 years now." That explained the gray dress. Colton simply nodded, unused to conversation that wasn't conducted over cards or gun barrels. "Widow Pearson's is this way." He led her to a modest 2-story house with a small porch where an elderly woman sat in a rocking chair. After brief introductions, Colton tipped his hat and turned to leave. "Mr. Ingram," Florence called after him. "Why did you follow me?" The question caught him off guard. "Town's not safe." "And you appointed yourself my protector." "Just passing by, madam." He turned away again. "Mr. Ingram," she said softly. "Thank you." He paused, unaccustomed to gratitude. With a curt nod, he walked away, unsettled by the encounter in ways he couldn't define. That night, Colton sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the room above the livery stable where he'd taken lodging 6 months earlier. He cleaned his revolver methodically, the routine as familiar as breathing. But his thoughts kept returning to Florence Wilson, and the way she'd looked at him, not with fear or the morbid fascination most people showed, but with a simple human acknowledgement he rarely experienced. Dawn found him riding out to check on the small herd of cattle he'd been building up. He'd never intended to stay in Terlingua this long, but the remote location suited him. Few questions, fewer expectations. He drifted through much of Texas and parts of New Mexico territory since the war ended, never putting down roots, never forming attachments that couldn't be severed with a simple ride into the sunrise. When he returned to town 2 days later, he spotted Florence outside the sheriff's office, engaged in what appeared to be a heated discussion with Deputy Jenkins. The young deputy's face was flushed red as Florence gestured emphatically. "I don't care what arrangements you've made," she was saying as Colton approached. "My brother kept meticulous records, and these ledgers have clearly been altered." Jenkins spotted Colton and visibly paled. "We're just having a minor disagreement, Ingram. Nothing to concern yourself with." Florence turned, surprise registering briefly before her expression hardened. "Mr. Ingram, perhaps you can help settle a matter. The deputy claims my brother authorized substantial payments to the mining company for protection services." "I find that unlikely, given James's letters about standing up to their extortion attempts." Colton studied Jenkins, noting the nervous twitch in the man's left eye. "Your brother refused to pay them a cent," he confirmed. "Said the law wasn't for sale." Jenkins sputtered. "Now wait just a minute. The receipts, deputy," Florence interrupted, extending her hand. With a muttered curse, Jenkins retreated into the office and returned with a stack of papers which he thrust at her. "Fine. But don't come crying when those mine boys make trouble." Sheriff didn't understand how things work out here. "I think he understood perfectly," Florence replied coolly, leafing through the documents. "And I intend to honor his principles while I'm here." After Jenkins stormed off, Florence exhaled slowly. "Thank you again, Mr. Ingram. I seem to be accumulating debts to you. Your brother was a good man, deserves better than having his name used for theft." She studied him with that penetrating gaze. "You don't say much, do you?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Not much worth saying." "In my experience, those with the least to say often have the most worth hearing." She tucked the papers into a leather portfolio. "I'm headed to my brother's house to continue sorting his belongings. Would you walk with me? I have questions about Terlingua, and you seem to be one of the few straightforward people here." The request surprised him, but he found himself nodding. As they walked toward the modest house at the edge of town, Florence asked about the community who held power, who could be trusted, which of her brother's initiatives had made a difference. "Mining company runs most things," Colton explained. "Sheriff Dawson was trying to change that." "Made him enemies." Florence stopped walking. "You think his fever was convenient?" Colton chose his words carefully. "Town doctor's honest. If he said fever, it was fever, but your brother was making progress against the company. Some weren't unhappy to see him go." They reached the small wooden house, and Florence hesitated at the door. "Would you come in? I could use help moving some of his heavier belongings." The interior was sparse but neat, with a few personal touches: a bookshelf filled with volumes on law and history, a pair of spurs mounted on the wall, a faded daguerreotype of a younger Sheriff Dawson with a girl who had Florence's eyes. "You favor your brother," Colton observed, nodding toward the image. "We were close, despite the distance." She ran a finger over the frame. "He was the reason I came west after Thomas, my husband, passed. James wrote that he'd found purpose here. That one person could make a difference." Her voice caught slightly. "I was coming to join him. Start over." Colton didn't know how to respond to her grief, so he simply began moving the furniture she indicated. They worked in companionable silence for a while until Florence uncovered a wooden box tucked behind her brother's desk. "His service revolver," she murmured, opening the case to reveal a well-maintained Colt. "And his journals." She lifted several leather-bound books, opening one to reveal neat, precise handwriting. As she flipped through the pages, her expression changed. "Mr. Ingram, did you know my brother was investigating the mining company's land claims?" Colton moved closer, looking at the journal over her shoulder. The pages detailed suspicious title transfers and threatened homesteaders. "He mentioned concerns," Colton confirmed. "Said something didn't add up with their expansion." Florence closed the journal decisively. "Then I need to continue his work." "Madam, that's dangerous territory. Those men don't play by rules." "Neither did the men who tried to intimidate female teachers in Boston," she replied with unexpected steel. "I didn't back down then either." For the first time in years, Colton felt something like admiration stir within him. "You're not what I expected, Mrs. Wilson." "Few women are what men expect, Mr. Ingram. That's our advantage." She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her face. "Would you join me for supper, as thanks for your help?" The invitation caught him off guard. "I'm not much for social calls." "It's just a meal, Mr. Ingram." "Not a social obligation." Her eyes held amusement. "Unless conversation with a widowed schoolteacher terrifies you more than gunfights." The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. 7 o'clock, he conceded, suddenly aware of his trail-dusty clothes and unshaven jaw. That evening, having bathed and donned his least-worn shirt, Colton arrived at the sheriff's house to find Florence had transformed the simple table with a clean cloth and the delicious aroma of beef stew. "I hope you don't mind simple fare," she said, gesturing for him to sit. The general store had limited options. "Been living on my own, cooking too long to be particular," he replied, accepting the bowl she offered. The meal passed more comfortably than he'd anticipated. Florence spoke of her teaching in Boston, her brother's letters about the frontier, and her own desire to perhaps start a school in the West. Colton found himself sharing more than he intended: brief mentions of his Texas childhood, his reluctant service in the war, the restlessness that had driven him since. "You've never settled anywhere?" she asked as they finished. Never found a reason to. She considered this. And what about family? People who miss you when you ride out. Parents gone. Sister married in San Antonio. We write occasionally. He hesitated. Lost too many people to keep collecting them. Is that how you see it? As collecting losses? The question hit uncomfortably close to truths he rarely examined. Simpler to move on. No goodbyes needed. Florence's expression softened. Goodbyes are difficult, but they're also a gift, closure, acknowledgement that someone mattered. Not always possible out here. Perhaps. She began clearing the dishes. But possible more often than men like you might admit. Before he could respond, a sharp rap at the door interrupted them. Florence opened it to reveal Deputy Jenkins, looking agitated. Mrs. Wilson, you need to stop asking questions about mining company business, he blurted. They're not happy and I can't, he broke off when he spotted Colton. Ingram, should have known you'd be involved. What exactly is the problem, Deputy? Florence asked coolly. You've been talking to the homesteaders west of town, stirring up trouble. Company wants you on tomorrow's stage east. Florence straightened. That's not going to happen. I have every right to settle my brother's affairs, including understanding what he was investigating. You don't understand how things work here. I understand perfectly, she countered. My brother was building a case against illegal land seizures, and someone doesn't want me continuing his work. Jenkins' hand moved nervously toward his gun. Don't make this difficult. In one fluid motion, Colton positioned himself between them. Think carefully, Jenkins. You're in over your head. The deputy's eyes darted between them before he backed away. This isn't over. Company man wants to see you both tomorrow, noon at the office. He retreated, slamming the door behind him. Well, Florence said after a moment. That was illuminating. You need to leave Terlingua, Colton said firmly. Your brother got too close to something and they're worried you'll finish what he started, which confirms I'm on the right track. Her chin lifted stubbornly. I won't be intimidated. This isn't Boston. Men like Harrison from the mining company don't worry about reputations or legal niceties. They make problems disappear. Then I'll need to be very visible. She began pacing. Tomorrow, we'll meet with Harrison as requested. In public where he can't simply make us disappear, and I'll bring James's documentation. She stopped, looking directly at him. Yes, Mr. Ingram, unless you're planning to ride out without saying goodbye. The challenge in her words was unmistakable. Colton realized with some surprise that the thought of leaving her to face this alone disturbed him deeply. I'll be here at 11, he said finally, but we do this my way. The next morning, Colton arrived to find Florence dressed in a deep blue dress that made her look both respectable and formidable. She carried a leather satchel containing her brother's journals and land records. You're armed? He asked, noticing the slight bulge at her waist. She lifted her skirt just enough to reveal her brother's revolver in a makeshift holster. I'm not naive, Mr. Ingram. They walked to the mining company office, attracting curious glances from townspeople unused to seeing the solitary gunman in female company. The office occupied the largest building in Terlingua, its false front advertising progress through industry, in bold letters. Inside, they were immediately shown to a well-appointed office where Elias Harrison, the regional manager, sat behind a massive oak desk. He was a corpulent man with cold eyes and an expensive suit. Mrs. Wilson, Mr. Ingram. He didn't stand. I understand you've been making inquiries that concern my company. I'm simply continuing my brother's work, Florence replied calmly. He had questions about certain land acquisitions. Harrison smiled thinly. Your brother was misguided. These matters are complex, beyond the understanding of local law enforcement. Perhaps these will simplify things. Florence opened her satchel and placed several documents on his desk. Forged deeds, threatening letters to homesteaders. Records of bribes paid to your previous deputy. Harrison's face darkened. Where did you get these? My brother was thorough. And I've made copies, distributed to several trustworthy individuals, with instructions to forward them to the territorial governor and federal marshals should anything happen to me. Colton watched the calculation in Harrison's eyes, the rapid assessment of options. You're interfering with progress, Mrs. Wilson. This territory needs the economic development our company provides. Not at the expense of legal rights. The homesteaders will keep their land. Your company will compensate those already displaced. And the sheriff's office will operate independently again. Harrison laughed. You have no authority to make such demands. I have truth and documentation, Florence countered. Which would you prefer, a negotiated settlement or federal investigation? The standoff stretched for tense moments before Harrison's expression hardened. Get out. This discussion is over. As they left the building, Colton scanned the street warily. He won't give up that easily. I'm counting on it, Florence replied. Men like that make mistakes when they're angry. We just need to be ready. They spent the afternoon warning sympathetic townspeople and visiting several homesteaders who confirmed Sheriff Dawson had been building a case against the mining company. By dusk, they returned to Florence's borrowed house, both aware that Harrison wouldn't wait long to respond. You should stay elsewhere tonight, Colton suggested as they finished a hasty meal. Florence shook her head. They need to know I won't be intimidated, but I wouldn't object to company. The simple statement hung between them, loaded with unspoken meaning. Colton felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. I'll keep watch from the porch, he said finally. Night fell over Terlingua, the desert air cooling rapidly. Colton sat in a chair angled to view both the road and the back approach to the house, his rifle across his knees. Inside, he could see Florence's shadow as she moved about, eventually settling with a lamp to read her brother's journals. It was past midnight when he heard the soft crunch of boots on gravel. He tensed, eyes scanning the darkness until he made out 3 figures approaching from different angles. The moonlight glinted off a gun barrel. Colton slipped inside. Company's coming. 3 men, armed. Florence immediately doused her lamp and retrieved her revolver. Back door, covered. They're surrounding us, she nodded calmly. What do we do? Wait. He positioned himself by a window. Let them make the first move. They didn't wait long. A voice called from the darkness, one of the Blackwell brothers. Come out, Ingram. Harrison wants a word with the lady. Harrison's welcome to come himself in daylight, Colton called back. Hard way it is, then, came the reply, followed by the crash of breaking glass as something flaming arced through the window. Colton kicked the burning bundle back outside, but another crashed through from the rear. The dry wooden floor caught quickly, flames spreading toward the walls. We need to move, he said, grabbing Florence's arm. Stay low. They crouched near the front door as smoke filled the small house. Colton fired 2 shots through the window to force the attackers back, then pushed the door open. Run for the livery, he whispered. I'll cover you. But as Florence darted out, a shot rang out and she stumbled with a cry of pain. Colton fired rapidly toward the muzzle flash, hearing a satisfying grunt as one of his bullets found its mark. He scooped Florence up and ran, zigzagging as more shots kicked up dirt around them. The livery stable was dark and quiet. Colton carried Florence inside, barring the door behind them before lighting a lantern. She was clutching her upper arm, blood seeping between her fingers. Let me see, he said, gently moving her hand away. The bullet had torn through the flesh of her arm but missed bone. He quickly tore strips from a clean horse blanket to bind the wound. "We need to get you to a doctor," he muttered. "There's no time," she gasped. "They'll check here soon." She was right. The stable wouldn't hide them for long, and the town doctor would be the first place the attackers looked. Colton made a swift decision. "Can you ride?" Florence nodded grimly. "If necessary." He quickly saddled 2 horses, helping her mount before gathering his few possessions. They slipped out the back of the stable and rode hard away from town, taking a little-used trail that wound through scrubland toward a line of distant hills. After an hour of hard riding, with no signs of pursuit, Colton led them to a small canyon where a spring provided water. He helped Florence dismount, noting her pallor with concern. "We need to clean that wound properly," he said, leading her to the water. By moonlight, he washed the injury as gently as he could, rebandaging it with the cleanest cloth he had. Florence bore the pain silently, though her face was drawn with exhaustion. "You need rest," he told her, spreading his bedroll in the shelter of a rock overhang. "I'll keep watch." She sank down gratefully. "What will we do now?" "At dawn, we ride for Fort Davis. Army post 3 days' ride. They have a telegraph office. You can send your evidence to the territorial governor." She nodded, then reached out to touch his hand. "Thank you, Colton, for not riding away." Something in the simple gesture and the use of his first name broke through barriers he'd maintained for years. "I couldn't," he admitted softly. "Not from you." The vulnerability in his voice surprised them both. Florence's fingers tightened around his. "That means more than you know." As she drifted into exhausted sleep, Colton kept vigil, his mind unusually active. He'd spent years avoiding attachments, moving on whenever connections threatened to form. Yet in just days, this determined woman had made him consider standing his ground instead of running. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. Dawn broke with no sign of pursuit. Colton woke Florence gently, concerned by the flush in her cheeks that suggested fever from her wound. They rode more slowly than he would have liked, stopping frequently for her to rest. By nightfall, they had covered less ground than hoped, and her condition was deteriorating. "We need shelter," he decided, studying the terrain. "There's a line shack about 2 miles east. Used it once during roundup." The abandoned cabin was crude but intact. Colton settled Florence on the single bunk while he built a fire in the stone hearth. She watched through fever-bright eyes as he heated water and prepared a simple meal from his provisions. "Why did you become a gunman?" she asked suddenly. "You don't seem hardened like others I've seen." The question caught him off guard. He stirred the pot of beans slowly before answering. "Came back from the war with one skill, found people willing to pay for it." He paused. "Became easy to keep moving, no connections, no disappointments." "No goodbyes," she murmured. "No goodbyes," he agreed. "That sounds lonely," he shrugged. "Safer. Is it, or just empty?" Her directness, even feverish, cut through his defenses. "Maybe both." He brought her food and helped her sit up to eat, acutely aware of her weakness. After checking her wound red and inflamed despite his care, he dampened a cloth with cool water and placed it on her forehead. "We won't make Fort Davis tomorrow," he said. "You need to rest." She caught his hand as he moved away. "Tell me something true, Colton, something you've never told anyone." Perhaps it was the isolation or her fever or the strange intimacy of crisis, but he found himself answering. "I dream about them sometimes. The men I've killed, not from guilt, just wondering who they might have been if our paths hadn't crossed." "That's not the thinking of a heartless man," she observed softly. "Maybe not. But it's easier to be thought heartless. People leave you alone." "Is that what you want? To be left alone?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Colton realized with sudden clarity that his answer had changed. "Not anymore," he admitted. "Not since you came to Terlingua." Florence's smile was weak but genuine. "Good." Because I've grown rather fond of your company, difficult as you can be." That night, as she slept fitfully, Colton kept watch by the fire, reflecting on choices and paths not taken. By morning, her fever had broken, though she remained weak. They stayed another day at the line shack, during which Colton found himself sharing stories he'd never told anyone of his childhood on a small ranch, his mother's death, the disillusionment of war, the emptiness of the years that followed. Florence listened with quiet understanding, occasionally sharing her own history, her passion for education, her brief marriage to a kind but conventional man, her brother's influence in encouraging her independence. "James always said I was too stubborn for Boston society," she laughed. "He thought I'd find my place out west, where women have to be strong." "He was right," Colton observed. "You belong here more than most men I've met." On the third day, Florence was strong enough to continue their journey. They rode into Fort Davis late that afternoon, the military outpost a welcome sight after their ordeal. The commanding officer, upon hearing their story and reviewing Sheriff Dawson's documentation, immediately dispatched soldiers to Terlingua and sent telegrams to both the territorial governor and federal marshals. "Harrison and his men will be arrested," the officer assured them. "The evidence is overwhelming, especially with Mrs. Wilson's sworn testimony." They were given quarters at the fort while arrangements were made. 3 days later, word came that Harrison, Jenkins, and the surviving Blackwell brothers had been taken into custody. The homesteaders' claims would be protected, and a new sheriff would be appointed. "What will you do now?" Colton asked Florence as they sat on the fort's parade ground, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains. "I'm not leaving," she said decisively. "James was right about Terlingua. It needs people who care about justice. I'm thinking of opening that school we discussed." Colton nodded, a strange mixture of emotions churning within him. "Town will need rebuilding after all this." "Yes," she studied him carefully. "Will you be there for it, or is it time for you to move on?" The question cut to the heart of everything that had changed in him. "Never stayed anywhere long," he admitted. "Never had reason to. And now," he met her gaze directly, "now I'm thinking maybe goodbye isn't the only way to end things. Maybe there are beginnings, too." Florence's smile was like the sunrise. "Beginnings require names, Colton, first names, between equals." "Florence," he said softly, testing the shape of it on his tongue. "I'd like to see what Terlingua becomes with you in it." "With us in it," she corrected gently. "If you're willing to build something instead of riding away." In answer, he reached for her hand, the gesture more intimate than any words he could find. Her fingers interlaced with his, warm and certain. 2 months later, the newly rebuilt schoolhouse in Terlingua opened its doors to 28 children. Florence Wilson stood at the front, confidence and purpose radiating from her as she welcomed her first class. Through the window, she could see Colton Ingram working on the new sheriff's office across the street, his gun belt replaced more often now with carpenter's tools. That evening, as they walked together along the edge of town, Florence noticed how the sunset gilded the desert landscape, transforming the harsh terrain into something beautiful. "You ever miss it?" she asked. "The freedom of moving on whenever you wanted?" Colton considered the question seriously. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I remember what I was really doing, which was running from connections, from the possibility of loss." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly, "from feeling anything that might hurt when it ended." Florence reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against the weathered skin. "And now I'm learning that some things are worth the risk." He covered her hand with his. "That saying goodbye isn't the only way to end a chapter. Sometimes you stay and write a longer story." "I like that," she murmured. A longer story. As the first stars appeared above them, Colton Ingram did something he'd never done before. He leaned down and kissed Florence Wilson, not as a farewell, but as a promise of mornings to come. It was gentle, this new beginning. Gentle in a way he hadn't known was possible for a man who had spent years avoiding the vulnerability of connection. In the years that followed, Terlingua grew and prospered under the influence of people committed to justice and community. The schoolhouse expanded, and Florence's reputation as an educator spread throughout the territory. Colton found purpose in building rather than destroying, eventually becoming the town's most respected carpenter while serving as a deputy when needed. They were married the following spring, a simple ceremony attended by the entire town. And on quiet evenings, they would sit on the porch of their home, watching the desert sunset, hands intertwined in the comfortable silence of two people who had found in each other not an ending, but a beginning worth staying for.